If you were forced to play the piano in a room full of the powerful, not to be praised, but to be humiliated in front of them, what would you do? The Harrington estate, one of the most opulent mansions in Manhattan, was glowing in the night. Beneath the gleam of luxury chandeliers stood handmade silk gowns, perfectly tailored tuxedos, meticulously rehearsed smiles, and handshakes that could seal the fate of entire corporations. In that world, no one was poor, but no one was truly sincere either. And amid those powerful people, there stood a silent figure. At the edge of the room, Isabel Hartley. For the past 3 days, she had coordinated every detail of this lavish charity gala, from the stage lighting to the placement of each flower. She was the one who made others shine. But tonight, she was the one pushed into the spotlight, not for honor, but for entertainment. When the scheduled performer cancelled at the last minute, Damien Harrington, the host of the event, a billionaire with an ego even larger than his net worth, casually beckoned Isabel forward. In front of hundreds of guests, he unearthed a past she had buried for 5 long years, a shattered dream in music, a traumatic performance that left her too broken to ever sit at a piano again. He asked her to play a simple piece to fill the gap. He smiled. His tone was gentle, but his eyes were sharp as blades. Everyone knew he wasn't hoping to hear music. He was hoping to watch her fall. No one spoke up. No one stopped him. She stood there, caught between a Steinway piano worth more than a year's salary and a room full of scornful eyes. Step back and she loses everything. Step forward and she might lose even more. And then Isabel walked toward the piano. She said nothing, asked no one, waited for no permission. Only her hands trembled slightly, and then came a choice. No one saw coming. La Campanella, the very piece that once shattered her, would now be the piece she used to rise again. Tonight, a woman seen merely as an assistant would make those who believe themselves to be at the height of power rise to their feet, and the very notes thought to be buried would echo once more, not to please anyone, but to remind the entire room. Dignity is never about where you sit. It's about how you rise when you're forced to kneel. If a woman were forced to play the piano in front of the ultra-wealthy, not to be celebrated, but to be humiliated, what do you think would happen? Perched atop the ancient stone hill of the Upper East Side, the Harrington estate blazed like a crystal crown against the New York night sky. The attendees weren't just guests, they were the very definition of power: tech billionaires, bank chairmen, titans of global finance. Every eye in the grand hall fixated on the Steinway grand piano at the center, awaiting a world-class performance. But backstage, where no one cared to glance, Isabel Hartley was quietly arranging sheet music. Dressed in a simple cream silk gown, which she had borrowed money just to rent, Isabel moved as if stepping through a world that didn't belong to her. No one knew she had once been a classical music prodigy, once hailed as the golden hands of Juilliard. No one knew that she had once held an entire audience at Lincoln Center, breathless. And no one knew that 5 years ago, in that very place, she had broken down, shattered completely, and vanished from the music world like a name, silently erased from history. Isabel hadn't come here to perform. She came to work, to serve, to make others shine. But tonight, in the very place she believed she belonged, only behind the scenes, a man would rip open the curtain of her past and drag her into the spotlight in the most ruthless way imaginable. Isabel had never liked working in homes that were too quiet, the kind of silence bought with money where even footsteps had to be as soft as silk and the staff were trained to become invisible. But the Harrington estate was different. It wasn't just quiet, it was arrogant, as if every wall had absorbed the cold expectations of power. Tonight's gala was the most important event of the year, personally hosted by Damien Harrington, a man who never needed to raise his voice to make others fall silent, nor issue threats to make a room adjust its very breath. Isabel had been on site for 3 days, executing every detail to perfection, from lighting table linens and white lilies to ensuring that the Steinway piano reflected the crystal chandeliers at just the right angle. Everything was going according to plan until a message popped up on her screen. Pianist cancelled. A short sentence, yet it landed in her chest like a hammer. The manager approached his face, taut, like a tightened string, whispering urgently, "Damien is furious, and since you're the one in charge of the performance segment, I think you should speak to him." Personally, Isabel knew exactly what that meant. She was being served up as the sacrificial lamb. There was no time to find a replacement. No viable options left. She adjusted her dress, swallowed a trembling breath, and stepped into the main hall where Damien Harrington stood at the center of the room like a glacier come to life. A perfectly tailored black tuxedo, slicked back silver hair, eyes like sharpened glass, slicing through the air. "You're Hartley?" he asked, skipping any introduction. Isabel nodded. "Where's the performance?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made the listener forget how to breathe. Isabel drew in a slow breath. She didn't yet know that from this moment forward, everything she'd buried for the last 5 years was about to be dragged into the light before hundreds of watchful eyes and perfectly measured smiles. The air in the grand hall fell unusually still. The opening symphonies had long ended. The wine in guests' hands had begun to lose its warmth, and anticipation was slowly morphing into irritation. Some guests glanced toward the stage. Others whispered behind their champagne flutes. Isabel stood beside the piano, feeling every hushed murmur pierce through the thin silk of her dress like tiny blades. She was about to step backstage to make one final desperate call to the agency when a voice cut through the room, familiar, clear, and chilling. "Ms. Hartley, I believe you could assist us." Isabel turned. Damien Harrington was looking directly at her eyes, filled with challenge and something disturbingly close to amusement. He raised his hand and crooked a finger the way one might summon a waiter. "You studied at Juilliard, didn't you?" His voice was loud enough for the entire room to hear. Isabel froze. One beat of silence. Her heart pounded inside her chest. "I happened to see your background when my team was vetting Halcyon events," he continued smoothly. "It's a shame, really, to see talent like that buried behind clipboards and earpieces." His words were soft, but they sliced like knives. All eyes turned toward her, curious, intrigued, even entertained. Why not play something simple, just to fill the gap in the program? Something light. Chopsticks. Perhaps a few guests chuckled. Isabel knew exactly what this was. It wasn't an invitation, it was a trap. If she declined, she'd be seen as uncooperative. She could lose the contract, the job, and her professional reputation, but if she accepted and faltered, she would become the joke of the evening. The whispered story passed around elite circles before dessert was even served. She was being cornered, standing between a Steinway worth more than her annual salary and a room full of people, silently hoping she'd fall apart. And worst of all, Damien knew it. He didn't need to shout, he didn't need to command. He only had to suggest and let her sink slowly into a pit carved out of her own pride. Isabel stood still. In the thick air of warped expectations, she could hear every frantic beat of her own heart. On the outside, she maintained perfect poise, but inside a storm of turmoil raged. She was no longer the sophomore at Juilliard, no longer the child who once sat curled beside an old upright piano at the public library practicing scales until her fingertips turned red. But the memories had never left her, and now they returned piece by piece, whispers, fragments, the icy touch of fear creeping back into her bones. She thought of her mother, the frail woman who worked 3 jobs just to pay for her daughter's music tuition. A woman who never quite understood Chopin or Liszt, but believed without question that music was the one thing that made Isabelle truly shine. She remembered the teacher at Juilliard who once said, "When you play Isabelle, you don't just make sound, you make truth ring out." And then she remembered that night at Lincoln Center. The lights are too bright, the breaths are too short, the fear is too loud. Every note in her head vanished all at once, like stars blinking out in a sudden blackout. After that night, she folded up every sheet of music, closed the lid on her piano, and chose another path, partly because she needed to survive, and partly because she was ashamed. But today, in a room built from opulence and prejudice, standing before a piano and an insult wrapped in silk, Isabelle understood there was nowhere left to run. If this were the final time she ever played, then no one else would write the ending. She stepped toward the Steinway. No permission asked, no explanation offered. Her hands trembled slightly, but her steps did not. She didn't look at Damien. She didn't care about the whispers behind her. All that remained in front of her were 2 things: the cold piano keys under the lights, and the only choice that could preserve her dignity. And then, without a word, Isabelle sat down, lifted her hands, and gave herself to the piece she hadn't dared to touch in 5 years. Franz Liszt's La Campanella. As Isabelle placed her fingers on the keys, the entire room seemed to hold its breath. Her cream-colored dress shimmered under the crystal lights, casting a soft glow that swept over the Steinway's curves like a silent warning. Damien stood just a few steps away, still holding his wine glass, eyes laced with a quiet anticipation for something predictable and laughable. But then, the first note rang out, delicate, precise, full like a pebble, dropped into still water. 1 second too. Not a soul moved. As La Campanella began its familiar whirl of notes, the once whispering gazes turned to focused stares, and the small laughter that lingered in corners vanished as if it had never existed. Isabelle was no longer seated inside the Harrington estate. She was no longer the coordinator, forced to be a spectacle in a room of silk and supremacy. She had returned to her first language, the one that no pain, no humiliation, no fall from grace had ever managed to erase: music. She played with the stillness of someone who had been broken and rebuilt, with the fire of a soul long buried and now rising, not for applause, not for redemption, but out of sheer quiet pride that needed no defense. The leaps of the right hand, dizzying to even seasoned pianists, flowed from her fingers like wind gliding over water. The sound didn't come from the piano alone. It came from somewhere deeper, from her mother, from childhood, from the darkness of Lincoln Center, from the years of silence she had swallowed, while no one noticed. She wasn't trying to impress. She wasn't trying to astonish. She was simply living truly. For the first time since losing herself, the grand hall slipped into a trance. No more clinking glasses, no more footsteps across the floor. Only the piano remained, pure, fierce, and impossible to dismiss. Damien stood frozen. At first his face held nothing but surprise. Then something else crept in, something unreadable, as though he were realizing that he was no longer the author of the story unfolding before him. As the final section of the piece approached, Isabelle accelerated, her hands soaring across the keyboard like a storm, each note falling like fireworks in a room only used to polite applause. And then the music ended. 1 second of silence too. She remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the keys, breath rapid, but eyes calm. It wasn't the silence of shock, it was the silence of reverence. At the back of the room, an old man dropped his wine glass. No one turned to look. Applause erupted through the room like summer thunder, loud, unforced, and undeniable. The entire hall rose to its feet. Eyes that once held doubt now looked up at Isabel with admiration. She didn't bow, she didn't smile. She simply stood quietly in the middle of the ovation, as if she had known this moment would come. A man stepped forward, the artistic director of the Metropolitan Arts Foundation. He extended his hand, voice steady. "We're searching for a judge for this year's auditions. After tonight, no one is more qualified than you." Then came a second person, a third. Business cards slipped from designer suits. Invitations to perform, to teach, to partner came flooding in like waves. In just a few minutes, the distance between her and the elite dissolved completely. She was no longer the event coordinator forced onto the stage. She was on stage. She was the center. At the far end of the room, Damien Harrington stood motionless, his expression unreadable, caught somewhere between astonishment, confusion, and quiet defeat. He no longer controlled the room. And Isabel, she didn't even look at him. She didn't have to, because in that moment, every spotlight had shifted, and this time it landed where it truly belonged, on the one who deserved it. Damien Harrington was still standing there, leaning slightly against a marble column. His wine long since gone cold. His face no longer held its usual air of smugness. Instead, there was a strange stillness to him, as if he were trying to recalculate the outcome of a game he'd just let slip through his fingers. As the crowd parted to make way, he walked toward Isabel. His voice, once steeped in arrogance, now carried a careful restraint. "Ms. Hartley, it seems I misjudged you." It wasn't quite an apology, but for someone like Damien, it was the closest thing to an admission of fault. Isabel gave a faint smile, unhurried, unbothered. "I'll have my representative get in touch," she replied calmly. "My schedule is about to fill up." The words were soft, but they landed like steel. Damien hesitated for a moment, then nodded in quiet acceptance. For the first time in his own estate, he was no longer the one deciding who belonged on the stage. And the woman he had once seen as nothing more than a convenient gap filler was now the one rewriting the rules. 2 months later, Isabel sat in her new office at the Metropolitan Arts Foundation. Morning sunlight streamed through the glass windows, casting a warm glow on a framed photo on the wall. Cinderella of the grand piano. The viral comeback no one saw. Coming beside it stood a modest baby grand piano, not as glossy as the Steinway from that night, but warmer, more honest. She had received hundreds of invitations. Her concert schedule was fully booked for the next 3 months, but this morning she was waiting for something else. The door swung open. A girl around 12 stepped inside, clutching a bundle of sheet music to her chest. Her eyes locked on the piano, like it was hidden treasure. Her name was Lucia. Her mother worked as a housekeeper. She practiced on an old keyboard at the community center. Isabel saw herself in the girl's slender frame, a fragile dream waiting for someone to believe in it. "Do you really want to learn?" Isabel asked. The girl nodded, eyes shining. "Then the scholarship is yours. We start on Monday." On her way home, Isabel drove past Harrington Estate. The lights were still on. The doors still shut, but her heart felt nothing at all. Damien had sent flowers and a proposal to sponsor an entire concert series named after her, but Isabel declined. Some bridges don't need to be burned, they just don't need to be crossed again. She thought about the look in Lucia's eyes when she received the scholarship, about all the dreams that had been extinguished simply because no one gave them a chance. And she understood. True victory isn't returning to the stage. It's bringing someone else onto it with you. Isabel had been forced to play by cruelty, but she had turned that moment into a declaration. True talent cannot stay buried forever, and real light never asks permission to shine. The story of Isabel Hartley is a rare melody in a world full of artificial noise. It began with what seemed like a small act, a powerful man at a high society party forcing an ordinary woman onto a stage not to honor her, but to turn her into entertainment. And still, she stepped forward. No one welcomed her. No one believed in her. No one expected anything but a humiliating failure. But what they didn't know was that Isabel had once been an artist, once held an entire world in her hands until those same hands trembled during one fateful performance and her dreams collapsed with them. 5 years later, standing before that Steinway, she wasn't just facing a difficult piece of music, she was facing fear, she was facing contempt, she was facing the very trauma that had silenced her throughout her youth. And then she played, not for applause, not to win anyone over, but because she knew if she stayed silent one more time, she would lose herself forever. The lesson here isn't found in the standing ovation. It lies in that very first moment. Her hands touched the keys, trembling, yes, but refusing to pull away. Because true courage doesn't come from knowing you'll win. It comes from being willing to face the very thing that once broke you. In a world where so many kneel before power, someone who dares to stand, even if only through a single piece of music, can silence the room. I believe there are many Isabels out there, people who've been hurt, mocked, pushed off the stage of their own lives. But do you know the most beautiful truth? Real light doesn't ask for permission to shine, and true talent, if given even a single moment to be heard, can make the whole world go quiet. If you've ever been dismissed, silenced, or wondered whether your worth would ever be seen, then this story is for you. Leave a comment if Isabel's journey moved you. Share this video with someone who might need a spark of hope. And if you believe in the power of courage, kindness, and the quiet strength of those who fight simply to be themselves, follow and subscribe to Toch Story. We don't tell stories to entertain. We tell them to remind each other, even if the world turns its back, there are still moments powerful enough to make it stop and look again. And sometimes, the one who was forced to play turns out to be the one who makes the whole room rise to its feet.